Good morning, everyone. My name is Wojtek Szanowski, and I'm a Deputy Director at the Sydney Nano Institute and also Associate Professor at Sydney School of Pharmacy. I'm very excited to be part of this beautiful connection between a Sydney Nano Institute and Center for Advanced Food and Genomics and our first seminar. And we have a distinguished guest. And before I introduce the chairs of the meeting, which is Professor Fariba Dekhani and Professor Alice Motion, I would like to just set a few ground rules. During the presentation, during the seminar, please mute your microphone. And then at the end of the seminar, we will have a Q&A session. And if possible, please unmute. Also, turn your camera on and then ask the questions. Also, I would suggest during the seminar, please keep your camera on because it is nice for the speaker to see the faces, nodding heads, and I think it will encourage actually the conversation as well. One information, the whole session will be recorded, and if you are not willing to ask the question directly, in the camera and the microphone, you can also type your question in the chat function. So now I would like to introduce two chairs of our session, Professor Fariba Dekhani from Center for Advanced Food and Genomics, and Professor Alice Motion from Sydney Nano Institute and School of Chemistry. Over to you, Fariba and Alice.
Thank you, Wojtek, for your introduction, and good afternoon to American and also good morning to Australian. I would like to introduce you to our Center for Advanced Food and Genomics, which is funded by the University of Sydney and established in 2017. It's a multidisciplinary research center that brings scientists, engineers, and clinicians together to understand the effect of processes on food structure, bioavailability, and digestibility, and also microbiota. In this center, we aim to develop technologies that promote a sustainable food system, good health and nutrition, while minimizing food waste to improve circular economy of the food. The center has strong collaboration with many industries, national and international industries, and we have so far 30 large international industry partners and national partners. To address the global challenges in the area of the food and agriculture, we have established 3 research teams in this center: Food for Health, that's looking at how to improve human health and well-being by diet; Future Food Processing team, that's looking at developing innovative food processing technologies to minimize food safety, quality, and nutritional integrity, and repurposing high-value waste. And the last team is looking at innovation in food supply chain that's focused on developing sensors and decision-making tools to understand food production and consumption and minimize waste and improve health and safety. We are very delighted to have the speaker today, Professor Mike Clements from MIT, to give us insight about future food. Thank you. I hand over to Alice. You're muted.
Alice, you're muted.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Fariba. You think we'd have worked out the unmuting by now, but it still catches me every now and again. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this seminar. I'm going to keep the introduction to Sydney Nano very, very short here. Sydney Nano is one of our MDIs at the university. We're very proud, myself and Wojtek, to be deputy directors. And essentially, we are trying to bring researchers together in an interdisciplinary fashion to take the field of nanoscience to new levels. And we have 6 grand challenges that you can look at on our website, and emerging fields of research in nanoscience. So if you'd like to join the Sydney Nano Institute or to learn more about what we do, we'd be delighted to hear from you. I'd also like to take a moment, importantly, to acknowledge country this morning. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land that we join you from today. And many of us will be joining from different lands, and it would be great if we could expand our acknowledgement of country in the chat by sharing the lands that we join this meeting from today. I acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And Fariba, would you like to introduce our distinguished guest, or would you like me to go for it? Okay. So I will, you would like me to go for it? I'm so happy to hear a fellow Northern accent this morning. We are delighted to have the distinguished Professor David Julian McClements, who works at the Department of Food Science at the University of Massachusetts. He's also an adjunct professor at Zhejiang Gongshang University, and he's a visiting scientist at Harvard University. We want to keep Professor McClements' introduction very short because he has so much to tell us, but he has an extraordinary record in his publications with over 1,000 articles in journals, a H-index of 142 and over 80,000 citations. And to add to that, 12 patents, a number of book chapters, and some really great writing in communicating science, so bringing his research to new audiences. We're going to hear from Professor McClements in 2 seminars. Imagine how lucky we are. So this is the first of 2. Next week, he's kindly joining us again from 9 to 11. And today we're going to be mainly hearing about future foods, how modern science is transforming the way we eat. And I will join us at the end of Professor McClements' seminar to help facilitate a Q&A and to tell you more about what you can expect to enjoy next week. But for now, I'd like you to join me in a Zoom welcome with an emoji round of applause for Professor McClements. We're delighted to hear from you today.
Cool. Well, it's absolutely fantastic to be here. Very weird to be doing these conferences. I think I'm doing another one tonight in China, and I did one in the Netherlands last week, and I think I did another one in Ireland a couple of weeks ago. So traveling the world from my desk, and the scenery seems to look the same every time I do one of these things. But you know, it sounds like you guys are doing some really exciting stuff, and you know, I think being in the food science area at the moment is amazing. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 or 40 years now, and I think this is the most exciting time there's ever been to do research in food science. I think there's so many exciting things going on different types of technology, from, you know, gene editing and food architecture, nanotechnology, and personalized nutrition. So I think there's lots and lots of science to do in the incredibly complicated systems we're working with. So I'll try and, you know, it's impossible to cover all of that material in one lecture. So I'll just give a sort of overview of a few particular areas that I think are really important in the modern food industry. As I said, you know, I think I think first of all, there's some really exciting science that's going on at the moment, but I think also that the problems that we're working on are really enormous problems that affect everybody. You know, there's huge problems with, you know, the health and wellness associated with the modern food supply. There's, you know, over 2 billion people around the world have got malnutrition or undernutrition, and there's more than 2 billion people have suffering from chronic diseases due to overnutrition, so things like diabetes and heart disease. So that's a huge problem that we need to re-engineer the food system to try and solve. You know, there's lots of food safety problems. So we've got a globalized food supply which spans across the world, and we're getting ingredients from all over and we're bringing them together. So we have to make sure that the foods are safe, and we have new technologies to test those foods. There's also sort of food sustainability issues. You know, the global population is growing, people are becoming richer, and, you know, that's putting a more and more strain on the food supply because we have to feed everybody. And so we're trying to make our foods healthier and more sustainable. But as we do that, we have to make sure that they taste good, because nobody's going to eat them if they don't taste good, if they're not affordable, and if they're not convenient. So we want to combine all of these different things together. And one way to do that is to use sort of food design approaches. So if you look at food design, you sort of the traditional method of designing foods was really almost like a Darwinian evolution approach. Some of the foods that we're all familiar with have got a very long history, thousands and thousands of years of history. And somebody didn't just sit down and say, I'm going to make bread or beer. These were things that developed incrementally over, hundreds or thousands of years. As somebody had made a slight accident, they might have left the like a slurry of wheat out for too long and it fermented a little bit and it tasted a little bit better. So you took that and then you did something else. And over time you ended up with beer and wine or other things. But I think in the modern world, we need to be able to produce foods much more quickly and, come up with innovations more quickly. And I think the opposite to this sort of Darwinian evolution kind of approach of developing foods is sort of the Star Trek method. So when I was growing up, it was, Captain Kirk on the Starship Enterprise. And as part of the Starship Enterprise, they have this food replicator machine. So, you could go up to there, you could type in what kind of food you want. If you wanted roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, you could type it in and it would print it out for you. So at the time that seemed really far-fetched, but so did, like the phones they had. I remember they had like a special phone and you could actually see somebody on the phone. You thought that's never going to happen. And now we've all got mobile phones. And it's the same thing with these food replicators. So that what got me really thinking about sort of food design was I was invited to a meeting in Boston, probably maybe 10 years or so ago now. And it was this mathematician, Eric Bonobo. So he was a complexity theorist. And he got a grant from NASA to make a 3D printer, so almost like the Starship replicator, to create foods for astronauts. And he brought together an astronaut. So Leroy Chiao was the commander on the International Space Station. He brought a molecular gastronomy chef. He brought an author who wrote this really great book on food and cooking. And I was there to provide some information about emulsions and things like that. And it was really a really exciting meeting. And, they brought all these different engineers and scientists and chefs together. But I remember leaving the meeting and thinking, that's a crazy idea. This is never going to work. It's never going to be practical. And then, you look at 10 years later and, people are 3D printing everything. So if you look in London, there's actually a restaurant where they sort of 3D print the chairs, they 3D print the tables, they 3D print the cutlery, and they also 3D print the food. So you can just type in what you want and you can 3D print it. So this idea is, not preposterous. And, if you're in Europe, you can buy 3D printers for a few $1,000s now and create all of these sort of really interesting sculptures. So I think if you were training to be a chef and you spent years and years trying to train to make these really sophisticated structures to put on cakes or whatever you wanted to do in a high-end restaurant, probably much better training as a software engineer, because if you can program these 3D printers and make these kind of structures, you don't need the skills of a chef anymore. So what I'll do now is I look at how we can use some of these sort of food design principles to solve, real world problems. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one of the big problems is, the sustainability of the modern food supply. The global population is growing, people are becoming wealthier, larger fraction of people are moving into urban environments, and many people are trying to move to a more westernized diet. And that often involves eating more sort of meat. So, it's estimated that we might have to produce up to 70% more food by 2050. So this is going to be a huge problem. And I think it's something that as food scientists, we really need to address. I mean, there's lots of different solutions to it, but some of them involve being able to redesign foods. And one of the biggest problems, as I said, is people are eating more and more animal-based foods. So things like, egg, milk, cheese, and most importantly, meat, and in particular beef. If you look at how efficient cows are at changing inputs, so in this case, sort of grass and stuff, into sort of proteins, cows are very, very inefficient at creating protein. Whereas you look at something like plants, if you just eat the plant directly, it's much, much more efficient. And then also, if you look at the greenhouse gases, you get much more greenhouse gases from beef production than you do from plant-based foods. So if we could, reduce the amount of animal foods we could consume, we can have a really big impact on the environment and on land use and water use. Again, just to put that into perspective, if you look at the available agricultural land and how it's used, almost 77% of it is used for livestock. So this is either to keep the livestock or to grow the food that's going to feed the livestock, and only 23% is for crops for human beings. But if you actually look at the amount of calories in our diet, it's only about 17% of it comes from livestock, and 83% comes from this small number of crops. So again, if we can reduce the amount of animal foods we eat, then we can have a huge impact on the environment. But that's easier said than done. A lot of us have grown up eating meat-based foods. And, it's often seen as a status symbol to eat foods that have got meat in them or animal products in them. So what we're going to consider now is like, how can we try to improve the world by deconstructing the burger so that we can, create alternatives that people actually want to eat. So the first thing you need to do is really understand, what makes a burger taste like it does. And people have done like microscopy studies. You can see you have things like you'd expect in there, like meat, but you also have things like blood vessels, fat tissue, nerve tissue, and things like parasites in meat. So a lot of sort of yucky stuff in there. So if you're trying to sort of mimic meat, the easiest way to mimic it is to actually use meat. And probably you've all heard about these sort of cultured burgers where instead of growing animal cells in an animal, you grow them in a petri dish, or you grow them in a fermentation tank. So this was, some work which originally started off with NASA. So in the 1990s, they were trying to make sort of grow fish in a culture disc so they could feed astronauts in outer space. And then in Europe, they developed these in the sort of early 2010s and stuff. So they're able to take a cell from a cow, grow it in a fermentation tank, and it's sort of, if you've got the right nutrients there and the right temperature conditions and growth factors, it will grow into meat cells. And you have to exercise these meat cells so that they get the right structure. And then once you get them, you can grind them up and you can make a burger from it. So the first the first taste test of these burgers that was done was in 2013. And they had some chefs and other people taste these burgers, and they said they were too dry, which is surprising because it cost nearly a third of $1,000,000 of investment to develop this. So that's a very expensive burger for something that tastes dry. So one of the questions people ask is like, that's a really interesting idea. And I think you had a talk on it recently, I saw on your website, is are people actually going to eat these sort of cultured foods? And I think they're getting fairly close to sort of commercial application now. So this is a company based near San Francisco called Just Foods. And they're using that technology in order to create different kinds of chicken products. So on their website, they've got a really nice video where they show a video of some of the staff members from the company, and they're having like a picnic, and they're eating these chicken nuggets. And these chicken nuggets came from a chicken called Ian. And Ian is running around the table as they're eating the chicken nuggets, which is really weird. That you could actually eat something that's still alive. So I think they took one of the feathers and grew a cell from the feather to get these chicken nuggets. So that's, I think, weird, interesting, and exciting science. And they claim that they're going to have some products on the market fairly soon. I think companies have been claiming that for a long time. But what will probably happen is there'll be very high-end products at the beginning, and then over time, the cost will come down. So if you wanted to, you could, instead of, growing a chicken or a cow, you could actually grow some of your favorite celebrities. So you could take cells from, a famous film star or sports person or a singer, and you could grow them up and make like a celebrity burger. So for example, if you were watching the Ashes, you could have like a Clarky burger or something like that to celebrate as, England thrash Australia again in the Ashes. Alternatively, you could actually make a burger out of yourself. So you can make like a cannibal burger. So you could make like a Big Mac burger. We could take a few cells from my arm or somewhere else and make a burger. So again, sort of very strange things we could do in the future things that we probably wouldn't do, because I don't think most governments would let you make cannibal burgers. So another alternative is, instead of having this cultured meat, is to actually have bug burgers, so eat insects, and these are becoming more and more popular. There's a restaurant in the UK called Grub Kitchen where they serve a whole menu which is based on different kinds of insects. And one of the key things that's driving this area is, again, that they're much more sustainable. So if you feed insects sort of waste material and they're converted into insect flesh, you get a much higher protein yield than you do from sort of different types of animal products. And these are becoming more popular now. Even in Europe, you can actually buy some of these sort of bug burgers in the supermarket now. So why should you eat these different types of bugs? I mean, one of the reasons is because they've actually got a really good nutritional profile. They have a higher protein content than meat and fish. They've got a lower fat content, and the fat that they do have is really rich in omega-3 fatty acids. And we all know that omega-3 fatty acids are good for health. They also have a good fiber content. So, by switching from beef to different kinds of edible insects, we can, improve the nutritional profile, but we may also have big sustainability benefits as well. So the big problem that we might have in this area is what's called the yuck factor. If you look at some of these are some recipes from the internet of different kinds of foods that people have used to put bugs in. And, many people in the Western world just don't think about eating bugs and don't want to eat bugs. And I think that's the biggest challenge in this area, is how to get people more comfortable with eating insects. But then if you look at it, if you look at meat and if you were walking around a farm in the countryside and you came across a cow, you wouldn't think, wow, I want to eat that cow, and I think we've just got so used to eating meat, we don't realize what a yuck factor there is actually consuming animal products. So maybe it's just cultural bias. If you look around the world, there's actually 2 billion people already eat insects in the world as a common part of their diet. And if you look at some of the things we do eat in the West, things like lobsters are like it's like a giant ocean cockroach, or, shrimps are like a sea locust, eels are just like a big river worm. And oysters, I have no clue why anybody would want to put that in the mouth at all. It just seems like a big sort of shell full of snot to me. So I think there is some cultural bias. And if you think about things like lobsters, maybe 100 or 200 years ago in New England, this was seen as a food which was really for impoverished people and prisoners. They were really abundant on the coast of New England. And nobody wanted to eat them apart from the poorer people. And now this is a real delicacy in New England, and they're very, very expensive to buy. And maybe this is going to be the same with cockroaches or crickets or locusts in the future. Maybe once we get over our cultural bias, we'll see them as being really nice foods too. So one of the ways to get around the yuck factor is, instead of eating the whole insects like people do in lots of parts of the world, is what we can do is we can process the insects and we can convert them into things like flours. And then we can use these flours to make different kinds of food products. So things like, protein bars or cakes or bread or something like that. But I think to do that, you really need a lot of food science to understand what's in these flours and how they behave in different types of food products, so that we get the right texture and the appearance and taste so people actually want to eat the products. And we can also use these as bugs as like a source of different types of functional ingredients. So for example, we can, a bug's made up of lots of different types of proteins, and all these proteins have different functional properties. So can we actually use bugs to isolate different types of functional proteins? So can we find things like gelling agents? So we can make like a bug jelly, or emulsifiers. So we can make things like salad dressings out of, bug proteins, or foaming agents like whipped cream. So we've done that. We've isolated, working with a group in Canada, we've isolated proteins from bugs and made nanoparticles out of them to encapsulate different types of bioactive agents, so we can stabilize them and incorporate them into foods. So this is, I think, could be an important area in the future. And if you look at, insects as a food source, there are companies now that are actually sort of farming these insects, and this is a company that's based in the Netherlands, and they've got these huge facilities where they're farming insects, and there's something like 7 billion insects in one of these factories. So that's like the same as the number of people on the earth in one of these things. So they're taking them and they're converting them into animal food, but also into human food. And one of the advantages of that is you can take waste materials that would normally get thrown away, you can feed them to these bugs and they'll convert them into a high source of proteins and minerals and vitamins and healthy lipids and stuff. So probably the area of burgers that we're most familiar with is sort of the plant-based burger. So things like Impossible Foods in the United States or Beyond Meat burgers in the United States. So these were very rare when I started writing my book on future foods. So this was a picture when I went on holiday to Miami in spring 2018, and it was almost impossible to find one of these Impossible burgers. So we've managed to find a small niche vegan cafe, and they were serving this Impossible burger. And this was a photograph I took of it at the time. And you can see that it looks very similar to a beef burger. It's got the same sort of color. When you bite into it, has a fairly similar texture, although it went a little bit mushy when you chewed it for a long time. And part of the reason that this burger tasted so good is that the Impossible Foods company had identified that heme, which is normally present in meat, plays a really important role in determining the flavor and color of beef burgers. So what they did is they found a natural plant-based source of this heme. So they found that in the roots of soybeans, you have this heme protein, which sort of binds iron and can give the desirable color and flavor that you need. The only problem is there wasn't enough of this heme in the roots of these soybeans to actually isolate efficiently. So what they had to do is use fermentation tanks and sort of genetically engineer this so that they could actually get enough of this to put into the quantities that they were making. But you can see, one of the big drivers for this is if you eat plants directly, they're much, much more efficient protein yield than eating beef, and they have much less effect on the environment. So I think, like in my lifetime in the food science area, I think this has been one of the most dramatic changes I've seen, and that's got people really excited in America. And just looking at the students, all the students are excited about this area. I just found out today, like this Impossible Foods is really expanding and investing a lot of new money in research, and they just got 50 new hires that they're looking for people to work in their company in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, to do the next generation of these sort of plant-based burgers. And there's a huge amount of money being invested in this area. And I often get asked to consult in the food area, by the food industry, and nearly everybody is talking about plant-based ingredients and plant-based foods and how to make them better and how to make them more sustainable. So again, one of the huge driving forces in this area is sustainability. So this was a life cycle analysis that was done at the University of Michigan. And what they did is they compared a Beyond Meat burger, which is a plant-based burger, with a traditional beef burger. And they did a full life cycle analysis. And they found out, you need much less water, much less land. There was much less greenhouse gas emissions and much less energy for the plant-based burger. So they said that, really surprising to me is, on average, every American is supposed to eat 3 burgers a week, which seems weird because I think I wouldn't eat 1 a week. But they're saying if the average American switched one of their hamburgers for a plant-based burger, that would be equivalent to taking 12 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million homes. So this is one way that by just changing our diet a little bit, we can have a really big environmental impact. But one of the issues is in terms of nutritional profile. It's often assumed if you eat plant-based foods, they're going to be healthy for you. But plant-based foods are, things like the Beyond Meat burger and the Impossible burger, very highly processed foods. And they contain lots of different ingredients. And also the nutritional profile is not a lot better than, a traditional beef burger. And in some respects, they're much worse. So if you looked on when they were selling these in one of the fast food chains in America, you could see that the Beyond Burger had actually more calories, more saturated fat, more sodium and less protein than a traditional beef burger. So this would really, if you looked at the label, this would look less healthy. So I think this is really a work in progress. Is they may have better sustainability issues, but we need to redesign them so they're actually healthier for you as well. And I think one of the most exciting things about this area is just the incredible complexity of science involved in order to make these plant-based burgers. And I think in some respects, it's much more difficult to make these plant-based burgers taste good than it is like an insect burger or a sort of cultured meat burger, because we're trying to make them out of plant proteins. So we had one of the lead scientists from Impossible Foods came and spoke in our university, and she was an engineer who was talking about how they actually made this product. And some of the things that they had to engineer into it. So there was things like the way that light was absorbed and scattered. So you had like it went from a pink color to a brown color. So you needed some chemistry and some physics to understand that. Trying to get the right aroma profile, so that the right concentration of volatile molecules, you'd have to know what was above a beef product and then also mimic that in this plant-based product. And then you had to get the right texture and mouthfeel. So again, that you need a lot of sort of hardcore physics to understand how these different proteins and other ingredients interact with each other, what kind of forces are involved and what kind of structures are formed inside these burgers and how they're related to the texture of the product and then how it actually breaks down in your mouth. And what I thought was really interesting is it even designed the sound of the burger so that when you put it on when you fried it on a grill, like on your 4th of July party or whatever, it actually sounded like a real burger. And that's to do with the physics of bubbles forming and breaking down, and the acoustics of bubbles popping and sending out sound waves into the air. So really, really complicated science and very complicated materials. So I think the burgers were complicated, but they're much, much easier than looking at some of the sort of whole meat products. So, a burger's made out of comminuted meat, and that's fairly easy to get the structure right. But if you look at something like a chicken or a pork chop or a beef steak, they've got a very fine, delicate structure that is very difficult to mimic. So I think this is what Impossible Foods and other scientists, and we're doing some work in our lab, are trying to mimic this kind of structure so that we can replace these kind of products in our diet. And why it's so difficult to sort of mimic meat structures is because of the incredible complexity of meat at the nanoscale and microscale. So it's made up of these tiny myofibrils, which are packed into these muscle fibers, which go into these complicated structures with connective tissue, muscle, and adipose tissue. So how can you simulate this very complicated structure in meat using plant-based proteins? And plant-based proteins are globular proteins. So these are really small proteins, which are like a nanometer big. So it's almost like, you're trying to make, like a rope out of marbles, tiny little marbles. So somehow you have to structure these proteins to form these complicated structures. So some of the work we're trying to do in our lab is like, can we mimic some of the properties of these complex meat products? So things like beef or chicken or pork. So can we mimic the sort of fat in these products using emulsion technology? Or can we mimic the structure of the connective tissue and the muscle by using phase-separated biopolymer systems? So we just got a couple of grants to work in this area, so we really just started the work here now. We're also interested in other things like egg and cheese and yogurt and milk. And there's been a lot of really interesting products in this area now, in plant-based milks, plant-based eggs, and plant-based cheese and yogurt. And again, you need to really understand the fundamental science that's going on in order to create these products. So in the case of these plant-based milks, you need emulsion technology to understand how proteins absorb to fat droplet surfaces and then how that affects the optical properties and the rheology and stability of the product. In the case of plant-based eggs, you need to understand protein unfolding and aggregation and how it forms, like egg-like structures. So another interesting area is cellular agriculture, and we're working with a cellular agriculture company based in Boston. And what their idea is let's make animal products, so things like milk, with animal proteins. But again, these proteins have never been inside an animal. So what we do is we take, we know the DNA sequence of a protein. So we can take the snippet of DNA which encodes for a particular protein, like a milk protein. We can put it into a plasmid. Then this plasmid can be introduced into a microorganism like a yeast or a bacteria. And then we put these bacteria under ideal conditions, so the right temperature, nutrient and growth factors. And then we can grow these microbes up. And as they go about their normal life, they will start churning out milk proteins. And then at the end of that process, we can separate out those milk proteins, purify them, turn them into a powder, and then we can use them to form products like milk or yogurt. And these are actually commercial products that you can buy now. So people have also done that with eggs. So this is a group, again, based in San Francisco, where a lot of this work is being carried out. And they're, again, using fermentation technologies to create the same eggs that you get in real eggs. So they're exactly the same proteins, but they've never been in an animal. But you can use them as food ingredients to, make baked products, things like salad dressings or other kinds of foods or nutritional supplements. So now I'm going to sort of switch topics a little bit for the last part of the talk. So far we've talked about sustainability and how we can use science to try and improve sustainability. The other area that's really important is to try and improve human health and well-being. And we all know that there's lots of chronic diseases which have been related to the modern food supply. So things like diabetes, obesity, and other kinds of diseases are increasing. And a lot of that is related to the type and quantity of foods we eat. So we're eating too much food and we're eating the wrong types of food. And that is causing dysregulation of our hormonal systems and our metabolism, which is leading to all these different health problems. So I think one of the arguments is, well, let's just not eat processed foods anymore. So it's processed foods that are the problem. We should all eat whole foods and fruits and vegetables and cereals and nuts and other kinds of products. And I think that's a really good solution. But I think a lot of people can't afford that, or they don't want it because they haven't got the time or the inclination to cook, food from scratch all the time. So they want the affordable foods. They want convenient foods and high quality foods. But I think in the future, what the food industry needs to do is design these foods so that they're healthier. And there's different ways you could do that. You could, for example, reduce the calorie density of foods to try and tackle diseases like overeating and diabetes. You can change things like the chewing rate or the digestion rate of food. So if you make foods more difficult to chew, or if they digest more slowly, we can avoid some of the problems we can get by getting nutrient spikes in your blood. We can increase the bioavailability of healthy components in foods, or we can control the location that different food components are released. So for example, probiotics could be released in the colon. So I'll just give a few sort of examples of some of the work we've done and other people have done. So one of them is to reduce calorie density. So if you look at obesity in the US, there's been a huge increase in obesity over the last 30 or 40 years. And that's linked to a big increase in diabetes. So this is leading to, a real reduction in the quality of people's lives, and also a lot of costs associated with healthcare to deal with these diseases. So one possibility is to redesign foods so that they look the same, they taste the same, they've got the same texture and mouthfeel, but they've got much less calories. So I'll just give you one example is, things like emulsion-based products. So I do a lot of work on emulsions. So things like mayonnaise or salad dressing or lots of type of sauces and dips, which are really high fat compounds. So can we reduce the fat content in these systems to make them healthier? And to do that, you really need to understand the relationship between the quality attributes of a food. So what's its shelf life, its texture, its appearance, its flavor, what its composition and microstructure is, and then the ingredients and the processing methods used to create it. And if we understand that, then we should be able to make a new generation of foods that are healthier for you. So just to give you an example with fat and how difficult this can be, fat plays lots of different roles in foods. So for example, in a salad dressing or other kind of emulsion-based products, the fat contributes to the texture or the rheology. So as you increase the fat content, the viscosity increases, you get a much creamier product. It affects the way foods look. So as you increase the fat content, things look lighter. It also affects the flavor profile. So if you change the fat content, you change the molecules that are in the air above the food, and that will change the flavor perception. And also it'll change the way it interacts with your tongue. So you can imagine, like, if you made a low fat product and you reduce the fat content, you change the flavor profile, you change the appearance, and you change the texture, and nobody would want to eat it. So you have to redesign the food to get rid of those problems. So some of the things you can do are use different kinds of structural design approaches. So people have used things like titanium dioxide to scatter light and change the appearance. But people don't really like that, and there's some safety issues. So people are trying to replace titanium dioxide with sort of milk particles. So these are by aggregating milk proteins together, or plant-based proteins. We can use thickening agents, we can use starch granules, or we can change the structural organization of the droplets in the system, or we can use encapsulation technologies to do this. So for example, we can use these wow emulsions to reduce the fat content. So you've got the same appearance and texture and mouthfeel, but you've got a much lower fat content and calorie content. Another thing that's been criticized about the modern food industry, which I think is a really valid criticism, is this idea of ultra-processed foods. Is it ultra-processed foods that are causing the problem? So these are typically foods that are full of fat, salt, and sugar, which are all known to be, cause health problems. But they're also, because they're highly processed, they also tend to get digested very quickly. And that can change the profile of nutrients in your bloodstream. So things like the glucose levels in your bloodstream or the lipid levels in your bloodstream. And because of that, you can get things like hormone or metabolic dysregulation, which can lead to diseases like overeating, diabetes. And the reason for this is mainly because our gastrointestinal tract wasn't developed for the modern food supply. It developed over hundreds of thousands of years for a different reason, from our ancient ancestors to early hominids, is, they lived in an environment where food was really scarce. And they needed a gastrointestinal tract where everything that they ate could be broken down very efficiently, and they could get as much energy as possible from it. So that's why we have these, acidic environment in the stomach. We have all these digestive enzymes, and we have bacteria living in our colon because it helps us extract calories from our food. So the problem was, like in the past, we ate some plant-based foods or some animal-based foods. They were digested very slowly. And if you looked at our small intestine, and we had the different regions of our small intestine, it's when you got to the ileum, there was still a lot of undigested macronutrients there. And because they were there, they sent signals to our brains, satiety signals, to tell us to stop eating. So this limited the amount of food that we could eat. But now we live in an environment where our foods are highly processed so that they get digested very, very quickly. So now we don't get as many nutrients there. So we don't get that signal to our brain. So we keep eating, and we tend to eat too much. So because of that, we get these huge spikes of metabolites or nutrients in our bloodstream. And as I said before, this can lead to this sort of hormone and metabolic dysregulation. So again, what we can do in principle is use modern science to try and develop a next generation of processed foods that can try and slow down the digestion of foods in the gastrointestinal tract. So, and there are lots of different approaches we can do that. We can change the physical state of fat droplets. We can cluster them together. We can add polymers to change the rheology of the gastrointestinal fluids. We can embed macronutrients like fat or starch in indigestible matrices, or we can coat them with indigestible matrices to slow down their digestion. So just to give you an example, this is some work we did with fat droplets. And we measured, we use an in vitro digestion method to measure the rate of lipid digestion as a function of time. And you can see that if you had free fat droplets, so very small fat droplets, they get digested very, very quickly. But if you encapsulate the fat droplets in these dietary fiber capsules, then you can really slow down the digestion rate. And you can do this by changing the pore size of these microgels. So the smaller the pore size, the harder it is for enzymes to get in, and the slower the digestion. So this could help to change these nutrient profiles in your bloodstream and maybe overcome some of the problems with not feeling satiated. And people are also working on other approaches, so using things like natural nanomaterials, so like nanochitin, has been shown to be able to slow down lipid digestion by interfering with the lipid digestion process. Okay, so last thing I'll talk about is sort of, trying to fortify foods with bioactive components to try and improve their health attributes. So what we're interested in is incorporating different kinds of nutraceuticals into functional foods. So people claim that these have got health benefits. In a lot of cases, the clinical trials don't show that. There's some evidence from laboratory studies and animal studies, but in some cases there isn't. So I think these have potential, but they still need to be proven that they actually work. But these are sort of different types of molecules found in foods that are claimed to have health benefits like anti-cancer, anti-inflammation, antioxidant properties. The problem is these are often hydrophobic or crystalline materials that are difficult to incorporate into food. So you have to have encapsulation technologies to do that. So we've developed a whole range of different types of nanostructured particles for different applications where you can encapsulate hydrophobic or hydrophilic bioactive components inside of them. So in one example I'll give you is curcumin. So curcumin is claimed to have all these health benefits like anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, but it's a highly hydrophobic molecule which is chemically unstable and is crystalline. And therefore you need some kind of encapsulation technology to incorporate it into foods. So what we've used is what's called this pH shift method. We've taken curcumin, we've dissolved it in an alkaline solution. So at high pHs, it tends to be soluble. We've mixed that with something like a plant-based milk or a plant-based emulsion or nanoemulsion. And when you adjust the pH, the curcumin goes inside the fat droplets or the oil bodies, and you get a nice suspension like this that you could consume. And what we did is we compared our plant-based delivery system with these commercial curcumin supplements that we bought from the supermarket. So these have all got synthetic ingredients in, or and they're very expensive. I think this one was like $41 for this one. So what we did then is we took our encapsulated curcumin, we put it through an in vitro digestion model that simulated the mouth, stomach, and small intestine. We measured lipid digestion, and we measured the bioavailability of the curcumin. And what we found is, with some of these products, you get a very low bioaccessibility. So this is amount available for absorption. So some of them would just pass straight through your bodies. You spend all that money and you just get orange colored poop. Other ones are much more effective. And we found that our plant-based one was just as effective as the best, most expensive commercial supplement. So again, this is a way you can use food design approaches to try and improve the bioavailability and then hopefully the bioactivity of these components. Okay, so I think, we're trying to design better foods that are going to be good for the environment and good for the human health. But the most important thing is always the taste. When all the consumer surveys are carried out, the most important factor that people consider is price, is taste, price, and then, maybe healthiness and convenience. So we have to take that into account when we're designing these foods. So I think in the past, the food industry really focused on sort of taste, convenience, and cost. And that's led to like all of these food products which taste great. They're very convenient, they're inexpensive, but they're leading to all sorts of health problems and to problems within our environment. So I think in the future, we need to eat more whole foods and have government subsidies, which will try and encourage people to eat more of these foods. But we also need to design a new generation of processed foods where we take into account not just taste, cost, and convenience, but also sustainability, health, the resilience of the food system, and ethical matters as well. Like making sure that people involved in the food chain are getting adequately compensated for their efforts that they're putting in there. So as I said, I could only touch on a few little things to do with future foods here. There's all sorts of other kinds of really exciting science going on in this area. And if you're interested in that, you could look at this book, that Future Food book that I wrote last year, which is where I learned a lot of the new exciting work that's going on in this area. So as I said at the beginning, I think this is the most exciting time I've been a food scientist. that I've worked in this area, and there's so much exciting work going on, and I think there's lots of stuff for us to do in the future, and I think it can have a huge societal impact. So I'll encourage, all scientists working in this area to sort of really do their best to, sort of change the food supply and make it better for everyone. So just to acknowledge, acknowledge the people who've supported the research in our lab, and also, all the students who've carried out the research. So now I'm very happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Julian. I think, again, we definitely need to give you a really loud round of applause. So please imagine that you're hearing that. That was a wonderful talk, and just so beautifully communicated. Took us on a real, a great storytelling this morning for us, with lots of science there. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. And I would ask everybody to please feel free to let me know if you'd like to unmute via the chat or raising your hand, because if you want to answer your question in person, that would be great. We have one from Dora in the chat, which we might start off with. Dora, if you'd like to unmute, please do so, and you can ask your question. Otherwise, I will ask.
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, then we could maybe that would be nice. Then we can see more of you, Julian.
All right, cool.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Really exciting times in the food area. My question is very general, but what are the risks for making products or foods that can have unexpected or unwanted consequences? Because our research with younger people shows that they're particularly concerned that they're going to inherit problems, not just related to climate change, but risks associated with changing the food systems.
Yeah, I think as food scientists, we have to be really, really careful what we do. I mean, just as an example would be, sort of margarine production and, trans fatty acids. That was supposed to be making a healthier food product from using plant-based ingredients. But by, introducing more trans fats into the margarine, it actually made a product that was much worse, that probably killed tens of thousands of people a year due to coronary heart disease. So I think anything we do can have enormous impact because it affects, millions and millions of people around the world. So I think we have to be really careful and carry out really rigorous trials to make sure that there aren't unforeseen consequences. So it's a really good question.
And do we have the policy framework or the legislation that protects the consumer from this kind of mistakes? Or how thorough are we with our research?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think every country's got different regulations, and some are much more rigorous than others. But, I think there's always scope for food companies to, or especially new startup companies, to put a new product on the market that hasn't been fully tested. So I think it is an issue, I think.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Dora, for your great question. We have a question from Tim. Tim, if you'd like to unmute, please feel free to. Otherwise, I will voice your question for everyone. Okay, I'm going to go for it. So Tim says that they're very interested in the in vitro digestion system that you described. Me too. It was a great diagram, and to think about how you'd create one of those models. I hadn't really thought about that before, Julian. And Tim says this appears to be a relatively simple system based on beakers and stirrers, similar to the Scheim system. What is your reasoning behind using this system rather than a realistic in vitro digestion system? Realistics in inverted commas.
Yeah, I think it's for these in vitro digestion systems, it's always a compromise between mimicking the real system, the complexity of the real system, and having something that you can do quickly and cheaply, so you can screen lots of different samples. So obviously, the simpler your model, the less accurate it is normally. So I think at the moment, everyone seems to be moving towards the standardized Infogest method, which simulates the mouth, stomach, and small intestine. And that's what we use in our lab now. And that method, it's a static in vitro digestion method, but all of the different regions of the gastrointestinal tract have been standardized. So we can compare results between different laboratories. And there's been some in vivo, in vitro studies, which just seem, at least qualitatively, you get a good agreement between the in vivo and in vitro studies. So I think that's probably, it's a good compromise between complexity and ease of use.
Thanks, Julian. Kamal, there's a question from you. Kamal, if you'd like to unmute, please do. Otherwise, I will ask for you.
You can ask for me the question. Thank you so much for a great talk.
Okay, thank you. So Kamal would really like to know if you've got any experience with crops such as sorghum, because it's such a staple for 500 million of the world's poor. Julian, do you have a perspective on crops such as this?
It's just not my area at all. So I don't know anything about agricultural science. I mean, my training is all, from Leeds, it was like as a colloid scientist or physical chemist. So I've learned a lot of the stuff I know from just putting this book together last year. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly important area, and I'm sure people are working on it using, gene editing methods to try and improve the resilience or improve the yield of these crops.
Thank you so much. I'm going to follow up with a question. Please do continue to put them in the chat, or just say, I have a question if you'd like to unmute and ask it yourself. Julie and I have loads of questions, but I'll try and, share the floor. I really loved your talk. I was wondering if there is already any progress, if in different food classifications. So what will we expect to see on a product in the future if it contains animal proteins, but they've never been in an animal? So how are consumers going to understand and really not be worried or concerned about what they're eating? How do we make that transparent and really clear?
Yeah, I think it's a really big, really important point is, and I mean, I'm all for transparency. So I think, and a lot of the companies I've talked to, like the one we work with in Boston, who's a cellular agriculture company who uses genetic engineering. I mean, they're really upfront that they're using genetic engineering, and what they want to do is they want to educate the consumers about what genetic engineering is and what are the risks and benefits of it. So I think we have to start there really, so consumers understand and can make informed choices. And I think that's very challenging, because even now people don't make informed choices. If they did, we wouldn't have the obesity and diabetes epidemics that we do. Mm-hmm. So I think, I mean, labeling and advertising is probably the main way, or maybe government promotional or educational materials.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm going to continue to share a few questions with Julian, but please do know that you can always jump in with a question of your own. Julian, I was also really struck by your image of the burger, when you kind of just painted just how interdisciplinary the research was to try and understand how to create a new burger, an impossible burger or beyond impossible. How does that work? How do you, as a scientist, because I think this is something we're really interested in both of our institutes, how do you think you can best foster those kind of interdisciplinary projects and make sure that everyone can contribute their ideas and who you should be talking to?
Yeah, I think, Impossible Burger does it by hiring lots of interdisciplinary people, and they hire a lot from like fundamental biochemistry and engineering and stuff. And we're just lucky in our department. We have a very small department. We only have 12 people. But we all get on really well, and we've all got very complementary sort of skill sets. So we have, people who do sensory analysis we work with. We have one of our professors used to work for a plant-based food company, so she knows the, sort of nitty-gritty hands-on processing parts. We have, chemical engineers who know all the sort of extrusion and processing bits. I know the chemistry and the gastrointestinal fit. So I think you've just got to, find people with complementary skills that you can get on with. And I think that's where you make all the really exciting scientific advances now. I think if you just stay in your own field and just keep beavering away, you'll make some progress. But I think if you want to make some really exciting work, you've got to work with other people.
Yeah. Thanks, Julian. Couldn't agree more. We've got a question from Jeff. Jeff, if you'd like to unmute, please do so. Otherwise, I can ask for you. I'll give you a moment.
Yep. got to work on finding on good evening, Julian. Fantastic talk. So just want to throw this in. Recent paper, co-authored by 3 past presidents of the American Society of Nutrition, concluded that the evidence for recommending limitations on saturated fat intakes is insufficient. This is not a widely shared conclusion, but it's interesting. So I just wanted to give sort of that question about, do we know enough about lipid intakes? Maybe since I have the floor, I'll just add one more in case you have time for it. The biggest change in Asia in food intakes in most countries in Asia in the past 20, 30 years is meat intakes. So it increased in Vietnam 7 times, China 8, 9 times. And of course, that's not a very fast food. You got to catch those animals or raise them like that. So I'm not sure what that driver is. Not advertising. It happens. So anyhow, if you have time for that, but leave you with that.
Yeah. I think that first study, I think it has been quite controversial, and I think, I think the problem is nutritional science is just so complicated, and it's so difficult to make definitive conclusions because it's so difficult to control diets and have standardized conditions to compare one thing with another. And I think the best thing is like what your granny said is just eat moderately, eat a little bit of everything. And it probably won't kill you. I think the problem is we just tend to eat too much. And the other one, and I think like the drivers for meat consumption or plant-based food consumption are very different in different parts of the world. I think in probably a lot of Asian countries, as you become wealthier, you want to have a diet that you think you see as more of a status symbol, and that might be one reason why you would switch to more sort of meat-based products. But I don't know. I think it's even in the West, I think meat eating is still increasing, even though vegetarianism is increasing as well. So I think but I think the younger people are much more interested in sustainability and health now. So I think that's probably the target that you need to aim at. But it's a very complicated issue. Yeah,
for sure. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Julian. Again, I've got another question, but please do jump in and just let me know in your question in the chat if you prefer to ask it yourself or you'd like me to ask for you. I was really interested, Julian. This is kind of a few questions, I guess. You've written books that make some of these very complex topics that have a huge amount of physics, chemistry, chemical engineering, bioengineering, all sorts of science, very accessible to people who are coming at this without a science background. And it strikes me that there's a lot of misinformation out there about food. And sometimes when a bit of something sciencey is slid into the description of a product, it seems even more dishonest because it's kind of, it sounds like it's more legitimate perhaps, or that it's got some scientific basis behind it. What would your perspective be, other than, trying to set the record straight with your own writing? What would your advice be for how we can better communicate aspects of food science and technology so that we are really honest with with members of the public and we can increase understanding?
Yeah, I think the problem is, I think we can definitely do that. And I think as scientists, you often want to tell a story because, people are really compelled by stories. So if it's a nice, clean story, people are going to be more engaged with it. But, a clean story very rarely happens in reality. It's often a really muddy, dirty story with that we can't really prove one way or another. And I think, as scientists, it's hard to convey that to the public. This is the best we know now, but there's so many things we don't know. But I think what happens is, like, journalists will often take a small scientific study, and then you'll see, like, curcumin will stop cancer, or eating berries will make you live 100 years longer, from some sort of really small study. So I think it's getting that balance between, telling a good story, but sort of keeping the science on it. And I think that's not true of all journalists, but I think, you know, almost every day, I get my students in my Future Foods class to look at that, and they can always find some examples of some miracle fruit or miracle nutraceutical that's going to cure some disease. And then you look the next week and the same thing is going to cause cancer and kill you. So, yeah, so I think it's trying to educate everybody about the complexity of the world and contingency of the world and the contingency of science. So it's not a very clear answer. No, I think the reason I try and make things simple is because I have a hard time understanding things. So it's only when I get it simple in my head, then I can actually try and understand it myself.
No, I can really resonate with that one too, Julian. I find that when you speak about things, when you teach things, you learn a lot more, and when you try and break them down so that they're for people who haven't come through the same training, it really consolidates what we actually understand about the research and the science. So I find it a very helpful process too.
Yeah.
I think if nobody else is jumping in with a final question, I will ask the final question. It's really lovely to be able to ask so many questions after a great seminar. I was wondering, you know, we've heard a little bit I've heard a little bit in the press in the last week or two about rulings about how we might be able to legally describe foods that are not made from meat. So, for example, whether in the European Union, you'll be allowed to call something a burger if it's a veggie burger. And, you know, you can imagine how this might extrapolate with some of the research that you've talked about. I wondered, firstly, what you thought about that. And secondly, why you think it is, I can see why we're trying to recreate meat or redefine meat because it's such a big part of our culture and our diets. But do you think we'll go beyond that? Do you think that, you know, in a few generations, if we have this non-animal meat that's not from living animals, should I say, do you think we'll move past this and we won't eat steaks in 100 years time or 200 years time? We'll be making something different.
No, I agree with you. And I think there's no reason why we have to make plant-based steaks or chickens. We could just make some plant-based, you know, nugget or whatever it could be. It could be orange or red or purple. It just has to be something that tastes good. So for me, but I think what's the reason these companies do it is because they're not really targeting vegetarians and vegans. You know, they're targeting meat eaters. So, because that's, you know, like still 95% of the people, at least in the States, are meat eaters. So there's a much, much bigger market for that. So you want to make a product that, you know, people, if you can get a small part of that market, you're going to make much more money. And vegetarians and vegans will eat it anyway. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think you have to make, you know, plant-based meats. I think you could just make anything that tastes good and hopefully that is healthy and sustainable.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. We've got one final question that we'll sneak in from Dora. I think, Dora, if you're unmuted, so if you can take it away with the final question, that would be great.
I just enjoyed the talk so much, I can't stop myself. So we know that there is a lot of vested interest from the current livestock industry, particularly in Australia. That's really, really powerful. And we see some parallels in the area of climate change with the fossil fuel industry. So how do we deal with this vested interest? Obviously, we have consumers that are kind of leaning very much in support of the current livestock industry as well. So how do you break this dependence and what do you do in this field?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think it's, you know, hopefully by educating consumers, they'll make choices, they'll choose more plant-based foods, and, you know, that will change behavior and change the market. And if you actually look at, you know, in the States, you know, some of the biggest investors in some of the plant-based and the cultured meat companies are actually meat companies. So things like Tyson is invested enormously in sort of cultured meat. So, I mean, they've already got the infrastructure for, you know, creating meat products and distributing around the country. So if they could, they probably don't care whether it's meat or not, as long as they can make a profit. So if you can, you know, make a sort of plant-based or cultured-based version and still make a profit, you know, maybe we can change their behavior. And I suppose that's the same as the oil companies as well. A lot of them are investing large amounts of money, but small relative to the overall company in clean energy solutions as well.
Thanks so much, Dora. And
Yeah,
thanks,
loads of great
Julian.
questions.
So we're going to wrap it up there because we know Julian has another seminar to give, and we'd like you to have a little break in between to be able to go and get a cup of coffee or whatever you need. That was simply a wonderful seminar. And the great news is that we're only halfway through this exploration of future food. So today we've heard from Julian a little bit about, or a lot about, how modern science is transforming the way we eat. And I think we've come a long way on that storytelling that you gave us today. We've got lots to think about how foods can really be designed to be more healthy for all of us, because anything that's good for the planet is also good for all of us, and how we can get more nutrients for our food and start to try and think about some of the major health challenges that we face that are linked to foods and the foods that we eat. Next week at the same time, Julian's going to be back, we're delighted to say. And next time we're going to be focusing with a little bit more of the nano perspective. So we're going to be looking at food nanotechnology, harnessing the power of the miniature world inside our food. So we're going to be zooming in, something that we really enjoy doing at Sydney Nano, and looking at things at some of the smallest scales and how nanotechnology can influence the future of our foods and agriculture industry. So we really hope to see you next week. We'd all like to thank you so very much, Julian. We've enjoyed that talk immensely. So could please everyone join me in giving a great big round of applause, either by emoji or by a mime, to Professor McClements. And we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone. Yeah, it's great doing it. So hopefully see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye now.
Bye.
See you next week.